In the spring of 1978, a 26-year-old Grace Williams sat in a leather chair that was older than she was, its polished surface cold against the back of her arms, and listened to a man tell her what her future was going to be. The air in the office of Mr. Abernathy, president of the Gallatin County Bank, was thick with the scent of old paper and quiet money. It was a smell she had always associated with finality, with doors closing, and ledgers being balanced for the last time. Her father's funeral had been 2 days prior, a stoic affair under a vast Montana sky that seemed indifferent to the grief of the small gathering below. The sky was still there, but now the world had shrunk to the 4-paneled walls of this room. Mr. Abernathy leaned forward, his hands steepled on a blotter of perfect, unblemished green. He was a man built of soft angles, from his rounded shoulders to the gentle slope of his thinning hair. He had been her father's banker and his father's before that. He represented the established order of things, the sensible, logical progression of capital and collateral, and in his world, a young woman alone had no place running 1,300 acres of farmland. "Grace," he began, his voice a low, practiced murmur of sympathy that failed to mask the condescension beneath it. "Your father was a good man, a hard worker, but times are changing. The farm, it carries a debt, $48,000. It's a substantial note." She said nothing. She had known the number. She had seen it in the worn pages of her father's ledger, a stark figure in black ink that he had been steadily, stubbornly whittling down. $48,000 was a storm cloud on the horizon, a weight that could press a person into the very soil they worked. To Mr. Abernathy, it was a simple equation, an asset, a liability. The solution was obvious, the sensible thing, the prudent thing. He continued, emphasizing the word as if offering a gift, is to sell. Commodity prices are high. Land values are skyrocketing. You could clear the debt, walk away with a considerable sum, enough to start a new life. In town, perhaps. You're a bright young woman. There's no need for you to take on this burden. The men gathered outside that office, in the hardware stores, in the grain co-ops, and the corner cafes, were all saying the same thing. They had been saying it since the moment the news of her father's heart attack had spread through the valley. They spoke of her in hushed, pitying tones. Poor Grace. That's too much for a girl to handle. She'll sell. Has to. They saw her as an heir to a problem, not a legacy. They saw a daughter, not a farmer. They looked at her hands, which were calloused and capable from years of working beside her father, and they saw only fragility. They believed they knew exactly what they were seeing. He was right, of course, by every conventional measure. The men who farmed the surrounding lands were all expanding. They were borrowing heavily from Mr. Abernathy, leveraging their assets to buy more acres, bigger tractors, shinier combines. The talk was of yield per acre, of tax write-offs, of growth. It was a gilded age for American agriculture, a time of boundless optimism fueled by cheap credit and a belief that the boom would never end. Her father had called it harvest fever, a sickness that made men forget the lean years. Grace looked past the banker, out the large window that overlooked the town square. She saw farmers she'd known her whole life climbing into new pickup trucks, the chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. They were good men, her neighbors. But they were caught in the fever. They were building houses of straw on foundations of debt, and they thought they were building castles. Let me tell you something about the kind of knowledge that matters. It isn't always found in books or boardrooms. Sometimes it's in the quiet observance of 1,000 sunrises over the same field. Sometimes it's passed down, not in words, but in the shared silence of a father and child fixing a piece of machinery. The language spoken in the heft of a wrench and the particular whine of a bearing about to fail. Grace Williams possessed this kind of knowledge. It was her inheritance, more valuable than the land itself. Her father, Daniel Williams, had been a man of few words and profound principles. He was a creature of the earth, as steady and predictable as the seasons. He distrusted anything that came too easy. While other men talked of expansion, he talked of consolidation. While they celebrated record profits, he used the surplus to pay down his notes and replace worn parts. He treated debt not as a tool, but as a disease. She remembered standing with him by the fence line years before. She couldn't have been more than 15. Their neighbor to the west, a man named Henderson, had just bought a brand new air-conditioned John Deere tractor. It was a magnificent green beast, and it dwarfed their own aging but immaculate case. Henderson had driven it over, full of pride, and her father had nodded politely, walking a slow circle around the machine. When Henderson was gone, Daniel Williams had spat a thin stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He looked at Grace. "See that girl?" he'd asked. "That's not a tractor. That's a banker's tractor. It'll be sitting in the bank's lot one day. The land remembers who pays their bills. The iron doesn't." He had taught her to read the land, not just for its fertility, but for its history. He'd shown her the subtle depressions that marked old drainage patterns, the patches where the soil was thin and needed rest, the way the wild sunflowers always grew on the south-facing slopes. A natural compass. He taught her to listen to the machines. A combine, he'd say, will tell you its secrets if you're quiet enough to hear them. The rattle in the threshing cylinder, the slight hesitation in the hydraulic lift, the change in the engine's pitch under load. These were its words. The most important lessons, however, were in the small worn ledger book he kept in the top drawer of his desk. It was his Bible. Inside, in neat, precise columns, was the financial history of the Williams farm going back to the Great Depression. Every bushel sold, every gallon of fuel bought, every bolt, every filter, every dollar of interest paid. But it was more than an accounting book. It was a testament to a philosophy. He had underlined in red the years of drought and the years of low prices. Beside them, he'd made notes. Held back seed from 54 crop, saved us in 55. Neighbor went broke buying cattle on credit, paid off equipment loan, slept good. That book was her tangible legacy. It was the physical manifestation of his wisdom. And in its pages, she saw the secret that Mr. Abernathy and all the other experts had missed. They saw a single data point, 1978, a year of prosperity. Grace, through the lens of her father's ledger, saw a cycle. She saw the inevitable pattern of boom and bust, of fat years and lean years, as predictable as the turning of the earth. The fever would break. The storm would come. The only question was when. She brought her gaze back from the window and settled it on Mr. Abernathy. The silence in the room had stretched, and he was beginning to look uncomfortable, his practiced sympathy fraying at the edges. "So, we'll have the agent draw up the papers," he said, his tone shifting from advisory to conclusive. "It's for the best." Grace took a breath. The air no longer smelled of finality. It smelled of a choice. Her father had not raised her to run from a burden. He had raised her to carry it. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the center of the room with the force of a dropped stone. Mr. Abernathy blinked. "I'm sorry." "No, thank you, Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I won't be selling the farm." He stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. For the first time, he seemed to be truly seeing her, not as a grieving daughter, but as an obstacle. Grace, be reasonable. This is not a hobby. It's a business. A difficult business for the most experienced of men. My father taught me the business, she replied, standing up. The old leather chair sighed as it released her. I'll be in on Monday to discuss restructuring the loan payments. I have a plan. She walked out of his office, leaving him sitting in a state of stunned disbelief. The walk through the bank lobby was a gauntlet of curious stares. She felt them on her back, the weight of their collective judgment. They thought she was a fool, a naive girl making a sentimental, disastrous decision. Let them think it. Their opinions were weather vanes, spinning in the easy winds of prosperity. She was anchoring herself to the bedrock of her father's wisdom. Now, let me explain the plan she mentioned. It was not a plan for growth. It was a plan for survival. It was aggressively, defiantly simple. First, she would spend nothing. No new equipment, no new truck, no improvements to the old farmhouse. Every single dollar that did not go toward seed, fuel, or vital repairs would go toward that $48,000 debt. Second, she would work. She would work in a way that would make even the hardest working men in the valley shake their heads. The subsequent 4 years were a masterclass in patience and grueling labor. They were a period of profound isolation. Grace became a ghost in her own community. She was up before the sun, her breath pluming in the cold air as she worked on the aging machinery in the pale light of the machine shed. Her father had taught her well. She learned the anatomy of the case tractor, the intricate guts of the Massey Ferguson combine. She bought worn service manuals at farm auctions and studied them by lamplight, her fingers tracing the diagrams, smudging the pages with grease. The whispers of the community followed her like a shadow. At the co-op, the men would stop talking when she entered. They would watch her load her own sacks of seed, her movements efficient and strong, and they would exchange glances that were a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They were waiting for her to fail. Each season that she didn't was a quiet affront to their worldview. Henderson, the neighbor with the shiny new tractor, once stopped her on the road. "Grace," he'd said, leaning out of his climate-controlled cab, "if you ever need a hand, you just let me know." It sounded kind, but she heard the undertone. "When you finally admit you can't do this, I'll be here to pick up the pieces." "I'm managing just fine, Mr. Henderson," she'd replied, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a gloved hand. "But thank you." There were moments of private doubt. Of course there were. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea no one else believed in? The loneliness of that path is a heavy cloak. One year, during the wheat harvest, the main drive belt on the old combine snapped. It was late afternoon. The sky to the west was bruising, the color of a coming thunderstorm. A breakdown like that should have taken 2 men half a day to fix. She was one woman, with darkness and a storm bearing down on her. She stood there in the middle of the field, the silence of the dead machine deafening. Dust and chaff settled around her. For a searing, terrible moment, she felt the full weight of it all. The debt, the work, the skepticism, the crushing loneliness. The whispers of the town seemed to roar in her ears. "You can't do this. Give up. Sell." Her hands were shaking. Tears of frustration and exhaustion welled in her eyes. She leaned her forehead against the warm metal of the combine, and she almost broke. But then she remembered her father. She remembered his hands, gnarled and stained but endlessly competent. She remembered his voice, calm and low, saying, "Panic never fixed a thing, girl. You just start with the first bolt." She straightened up, wiped her eyes with her sleeve, and took a deep, shuddering breath. She walked back to the pickup, got her father's old tool chest, and opened it. She found the spare belt he had bought 5 years earlier, still in its paper sleeve. And working by the headlights of the truck as the first drops of rain began to fall, she started with the first bolt. She finished the repair long after midnight, soaked and shivering but triumphant. She hadn't been beaten. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to change. The first sign of success was not in the fields, but in the ledger. The number, 48,000, began to shrink. 45, 42, 38. Each payment was a battle won, while her neighbors were taking on new loans, extending their credit lines to dizzying heights. She was extinguishing her fire, one bucket of water at a time. The land itself seemed to respond to her stewardship. She practiced the crop rotations her father had sworn by, letting fields lie fallow, planting clover to return nitrogen to the soil. The land was not a factory to be pushed to its maximum output. It was a partner to be respected. Her yields weren't spectacular, but they were consistent. They were reliable. The soil, which had grown tired and thin under the aggressive monoculture farming of others, began to recover under her patient hand. It grew darker, richer. The soil was waking up. Then, in 1982, the world tilted on its axis. The music stopped. The harvest fever broke and was replaced by a deadly chill. The Federal Reserve, in a desperate bid to fight inflation, jacked up interest rates to historic highs. Suddenly, the easy credit that had fueled the boom became an anchor, pulling an entire generation of farmers under. Commodity prices collapsed. Land values, which had seemed to have no ceiling, cratered. The storm her father had predicted had arrived. It was a brutal, merciless tempest. It started with whispers of trouble, then murmurs of foreclosure notices. Soon the red and white auction signs began to sprout along the county roads like bitter weeds. They were stark monuments to broken dreams. She saw them in front of farms owned by families who had been there for generations. She saw one in front of Henderson's place. His magnificent green tractor, its paint now faded and its tires worn, was listed first on the auction bill. Her father had been right. It was a banker's tractor, and the banker had come to collect it. The community was engulfed in a wave of fear and despair. The men who had once looked at her with pity now avoided her gaze. Their confidence was shattered, their pride stripped away by forces they couldn't control. They had gambled on the boom, and the house had won. Grace, who had bet on the bust, was still standing. She had no new equipment to be repossessed. Her operating loans were small and manageable. Her biggest note, the one Mr. Abernathy had urged her to run from, was now down to less than $10,000. She had built her house of stone, and the storm winds howled around it, but could not knock it down. One afternoon in the fall of 1984, she was in the barn, mending a piece of tack, when she saw a car coming up her long gravel driveway. It wasn't a neighbor's truck. It was a polished sedan, the kind that rarely ventured off the pavement. It was Mr. Abernathy. He parked the car and got out, looking smaller and older than she remembered. The soft angles of his face had sharpened with worry. The weight of presiding over the financial ruin of his community had taken its toll. He walked toward her, his town shoes crunching awkwardly on the gravel. He stopped a few feet away, holding his hat in his hands. He looked around the farmstead, at the neatly painted, if old, barn, the well-maintained, if ancient, equipment, the fields of healthy stubble. It was an island of solvency in an ocean of bankruptcy. "Grace," he said. His voice was no longer condescending. It was quiet, humbled. "Mr. Abernathy," she replied, her tone even. He looked at the ground for a moment, then met her eyes. The question that had been haunting him, the question the whole valley was now asking, finally came out. "How?" he asked, a simple, one-word plea. "How did you know?" "Everyone else, I told them. We all thought the good times would last forever." "Let me stop and ask you something. What is the nature of true vindication? It is not gloating. It is not rubbing salt in a wound. It is the quiet, undeniable proof of a principle lived. It is the moment when the world you built, against all advice, is the only one left standing." Grace looked at the banker, a man who represented the system that had nearly destroyed her neighbors and had so profoundly underestimated her. She felt no triumph, only a deep, weary sadness for all that had been lost. "It wasn't me who knew," she said simply. "It was my father. He never trusted good times. He taught me that a farm has to be built to survive the worst year, not the best one. He remembered the 30s. He said the land has a long memory for droughts and a short one for debt." Mr. Abernathy nodded slowly, absorbing her words. The truth in them was self-evident, written across the landscape in foreclosure signs. He had advised dozens of men, guided by spreadsheets and market projections. He had given them the best conventional wisdom available, and it had led them to ruin. This young woman, guided by the handwritten notes of her deceased father, had navigated the storm perfectly. "I was wrong, Grace," he said, and the admission seemed to cost him a great deal. "I came out here to tell you that. I told you to sell. It was the worst advice I ever gave anyone. You have the soundest operation in this entire county. Your father, he would be very proud." He extended his hand. She wiped her own on her jeans and shook it. His grip was surprisingly frail. It was the handshake of a man who had lost his faith in the certainty of numbers. It was the moment of catharsis, the closing of a circle that had begun in his office 6 long years ago. The narrative, of course, does not end there. The decades that followed were a testament to the foundation she had built. The farm crisis of the 80s was a terrible culling, but for those who survived, it presented an opportunity. Land, which had been impossibly expensive, was now cheap. Grace began to expand, but she did it her father's way, slowly, deliberately. She bought the neighboring Henderson farm at auction, paying cash. A few years later, she bought another parcel to the north. She never borrowed $1 more than she could comfortably repay in a single season. She bought good, used equipment, paying for it outright. The farm grew to 2,000, then 3,000 acres. The ledger book her father had started was now joined by several more, all filled with her own neat, careful script. She became a pillar of the community, but she never lost the quiet, observant nature that had saved her. Young farmers starting out would come to her for advice, and she would show them the ledgers. She would tell them about her father. She would talk about the cycles of the land and the market, about the danger of fever and the virtue of patience. Now, if you were to drive up that long gravel road today, you would see a woman in her late 60s, her hair the color of wheat straw in the winter sun. You might see her standing on the porch of the old farmhouse, which is still modest, still unassuming. You might see her looking out over the vast expanse of land, a patchwork of greens and golds stretching to the mountains. It is all hers. Not hers and the banks, hers. And if you looked closer, you might see her with a grandchild by her side. She would have an old worn book open on her lap, its pages filled with the faint, spidery handwriting of a man long gone. And she would be pointing to a line he wrote half a century ago, passing the torch, ensuring the wisdom endures. The world is full of people like Mr. Abernathy, people who will tell you what is sensible and prudent based on the weather of the moment. They will show you charts and graphs that point to an ever-rising sun. But the land has a different kind of memory. It remembers the flood and the fire, the drought and the frost. Grace Williams survived and thrived because she listened to the land and to the man who understood it. The experts told her to sell the farm to escape the debt. She honored the debt to keep the farm. And the land, which has no memory for easy money but a long memory for stewardship,